attendance of the workshop.
That's a good question. Yeah.
I mean, you gotta go through these slides.
Oh, yeah, you have to see them.
They don't just adopt it.
Oh, I was sitting there.
Good morning, everyone.
Some of those were, it can be stopped.
No, I got rid of those.
Mr. Nestor, are we ready to go there at CC8?
We are ready to go, but we don't have Dr. Liu, and we lost Councilmember Mitchell. Then we're trying to get her back online.
We got lots of input.
I'm here.
Okay, so you.
Oh, she's here.
Oh, she's there. Okay, there she is.
There she is.
I'm here.
Siegfried and Roy made her appear.
Okay, and
And Dr. Liu just pulled up and will be here shortly. 1 minute.
And
Okay.
Dr. Parker, would you like to appoint Dr. Burke to this committee for this meeting?
Thank you very much for that.
yes, I would. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I might just say that's.
Dr. Parker, Dr. Liu was just at the AQMP presentation, and he's right here, right now.
Someone talking about me?
Yes, indeed. I think we're ready to get started.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I'd like to call to order the Mobile Source Committee of July 22nd. It's now 9:02 a.m. Everyone is present with the exception of Supervisor Nelson. And I don't know, on my particular screen, I do not see Supervisor Nelson's location. Is that a reason, Paul, why that's not showing?
I don't believe he was going to make it
Okay.
today. He and the mayor had a metro commitment.
I know that we had on, I have a little calendar here, and it says that the mayor, McCallum would not be here. But it did say that Supervisor Nelson would be here. But anyway, we'll go ahead and get started since Dr. Burke is also with us. And our first presentation is going to be an update on the AQMP P for 2016 by Dr. Fine.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. Good morning, committee members. So we'll bring up the presentation if we can. This will be yet another in a long series of AQMP updates to this committee. We will likely be before this committee perhaps every month up until December board consideration with updates on the comments we're receiving and subsequent revisions. So this is a brief update on the release of the AQMP. We released the draft plan on June 30th. Along with Appendix 4 of the plan, which is the detailed description of the control strategy. There are additional technical appendices that were posted subsequent to that. Appendix 2 and 3 have been posted about a week ago. Appendix 1 will be posted today, and there's a couple more technical appendices we're finalizing this and next week. In addition to making it publicly available, we have been giving presentations to various groups, including public workshops. We had just completed this week our 6 public workshops, one in each county of our area, plus one additional one in the evening here at headquarters and one out in Coachella Valley for a total of 6. There has been some public interest in additional meetings, including meetings with stakeholders, but also public meetings. So we're considering a second round of regional workshops in October when we have a revised draft out. And then in November, we will be doing regional hearings as well. So meanwhile, there is one bit of good news that was announced a couple weeks ago. On July 8th, EPA issued a final determination that the previous annual PM 2.5 standard of 15 micrograms per cubic meter, as well as the previous 24-hour standard of 65 micrograms per cubic meter, have been met in the South Coast. Both of these standards have been superseded by more stringent standards, but these were some of the original standards that were set when PM 2.5 regulations were first promulgated, and we did meet those standards, which again is a huge accomplishment for the South Coast region. So in terms of the release, I'm just summarizing the public reaction and some of its public reaction and media reaction, and I've kind of divided it into three main areas of the comments that we've heard. The first one is this idea that we are relying on incentives, quote, instead of regulatory action. And a lot of the reaction in this vein came really on the day of release, probably before anyone actually read the plan. So we have been communicating over the last couple weeks with various groups and in the public workshops that in fact is not the case, that this plan actually builds on a long history and tradition of strong regulatory action on stationary sources, but as in past plans, that doesn't necessarily get us to attainment, largely because mobile sources are the largest share of emissions, and obviously because regulations in the basin over many years have already reduced emissions from our stationary sources greatly. I'll go into a little more detail on that in a moment. Another comment we've received is our measures on what we're calling facility-based measures, which are similar to what one would consider indirect source regulation or indirect source measures. We have received comments that AQMD should exercise its full mobile source authority under the state and federal law. We're taking a slightly different approach, at least initially, and I'll talk about that briefly as well. And then thirdly, we've getting questions, well, how realistic is it that we can actually raise the incentive funding that we need, that we have identified? Can it be realistically obtained? And what if we can't obtain it? Then what's the backup plan? So I'll defer that question to the next presentation. Henry Hoga will be addressing that. I will say that we have received some pretty broad support for the idea of raising this incentive funding and a lot of offers of help during the workshops and meetings that we've had. But again, I think there's some healthy skepticism that $1 billion a year can be raised. So we'll be addressing that in the next presentation on the agenda. So just to compare this plan to how we've approached previous plans. In previous plans, we have done an extensive analysis on the stationary source side, looking at all the sources of pollution, as well as all the technology that has been developed, and developed a very strong proposal for traditional regulatory stationary source measures. And in past plans, that has not got us to attainment. Even if we include some aggressive regulations on the mobile source side at the state and federal level, that still has not got us all the way to attainment in the past. So we have used what has been known as the black box, the Section 182E5 of the Clean Air Act, and which relies on the future advancement in technology to fill that gap. We've put off kind of being specific and defining those pathways to attainment in hopes that future technology would show the way. Since the first attainment deadline that is in 2023, only 7 years away, and since with recent technological developments, especially on the mobile source side, we can now see the technologies that can actually get us to attainment, whether they're commercially available today or are expected in the next year or two. We believe that we can define very specific pathways to attainment now based on the technology emerging now or in the next couple years. So instead of hiding behind the black box as we have in previous plans, we're trying to define what it's going to take to get to attainment. And one aspect of that is looking at co-benefits. There's a lot of NOx reductions that are going to come from the state's greenhouse gas reduction efforts, from efficiency transportation efforts and efficiencies in supply chains, and what we're doing with energy efficiency. All those things will get us some NOx reductions. We want to quantify the air quality benefits and get credit for that within our SIP. But even that doesn't get us to attainment So what we've done is, now that we can define those technological pathways, especially on the mobile source side, we have also calculated how much we would need in incentive funding to help that transition to these zero or near zero technologies that will get us to attainment. Also comparing the past plans, when we look at what we've been able to propose in terms of new regulations on the stationary source side through traditional regulatory regulations, and look at past plans in 2007 AQMP addressing ozone standards, in 2012 AQMP, which had an update to our ozone plan. What we're proposing in this plan is on the same order of magnitude of what we proposed in last plans when it comes to NOx reductions. About 3 to 9 new regulatory measures in those past plans, and now we're about 2 to 8, and over similar time frames as well. So in terms of how aggressive this plan is in terms of stationary source reductions, it is entirely in line with these past plans. However, obviously that doesn't get us to attainment, and we have to look on the mobile source side. So just a little more detail on staff's approach to looking at the stationary sources. We thoroughly evaluated every single stationary source category, every subcategory, every sub-subcategory where the NOx emissions are coming from. That's a detailed look at the emission inventory. We actually have to analyze all the measures that have been adopted, not just in California, but across the country. We're actually required by federal and state law to implement all those measures if they will advance attainment in the basin, and through state law as well. And we held a symposium on control strategy, soliciting ideas for control measures. We had the working groups that helped put together those policy papers as a prelude to the plan. And we've had 11 meetings of our advisory group, meetings with stakeholders. So we looked far and wide for all ideas on the stationary source regulatory approaches. At the end of the day, when you looked at what's available to us and what is feasible, we are left with limited feasible options for additional NOx reductions on the stationary side. But that doesn't mean we have not included the ones that we did find in the plan, and these aggressive approaches are within the plan. 3 general areas: additional NOx reductions from non-refinery flaring. The refinery flares are heavily regulated, but there's still a lot of older flares that exist at especially oil and gas production sites or landfills. And we want to be able to either change those old flares out for the cleanest flares, but more importantly, maybe that gas has more beneficial uses in the transportation sector. So we're looking at those as preferred options before we go to flaring. Another area is cooking appliances, especially on the commercial side. We have NOx limitations on new equipment sold for hot water heating, for space heating, for pool heating, all those other natural gas applications. There are no NOx limits on cooking appliances. So cooking appliances, especially in commercial sector and restaurants where these appliances are running for 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, we are looking to see what can be done in the way of NOx controls. It's early in the process. Not a lot of work has been done in this area, but we start to do that. We're beginning that technical work, working with the gas company actually as we speak. And then finally, further NOx reductions from reclaim. We are proposing an additional 5 ton per day shave by 2031. That represents another 35% beyond what was adopted by the board in December. And as you know, reclaim includes our 270 or so largest stationary sources and sources of NOx. So we feel that's a pretty strong approach to the stationary source sector. But as we all know, if all of our stationary sources were brought to zero emissions, we would still be a long way from meeting our clean air goals, which is why we have to look to the mobile sources. Just a little more detail on the stationary sources. When we break down where the NOx emissions from stationary sources are coming from, and this is in 2012, looking back to 2012, you can see the vast majority is coming from our largest sources in reclaim. And this is a pre-shave, so this is in 2012, not looking forward. And then once you look at some of the smaller source categories, you're looking at industrial natural gas combustion, residential natural gas combustion, then you start getting into some residential and commercial categories, many of which we have passed rules over the past 5 to 10 years to already control some of these sources. So you could start seeing some diminishing returns when you start looking at some of these categories and subcategories. and you're starting to get more into the residential or commercial building side than on the industrial side. So, but we looked at everything, and wherever we could find feasible reductions, cost-effective reductions, they are included in the plan. But beyond 2012, we just wanted to mention that just because we may not be proposing new measures in the plan doesn't mean that there aren't significant NOx reductions from stationary sources going forward based on rules and regulations that we have already adopted that we continue to implement, some of which haven't even had implementation deadlines that have occurred yet. So for instance, reclaim, we're all familiar with the 12 tons per day. We have Rule 1147 that is anticipated to get about 4 tons per day. Another set of rules, 1110, 1146, 1146.1, another 3 tons per day, and Rule 1111 at 3 tons per day. And a lot of these rules were technology forcing rules. So going forward, with already adopted rules and regulations, we expect to get about 22 tons per day out of that 64 tons per day on the stationary source side. Now, some of those gains are offset by increases in population. I already mentioned the NOx reclaim program, where we, if you add the 45% and 35% onto the base year, it's a total of 63% by 2031. And then, so if you add what we're proposing by 2031 to what we already expect to achieve with our already adopted rules and regulations, we have about a 30 ton per day stationary source NOx reduction between about 2008 and 2023. That's about a 38% reduction, with a little bit more proposed post 2023 as well. So again, the initial impression that we're abandoning the traditional regulatory stationary source approach, I think needs to be taken in context with the aggressive regulations that we are proposing, but in addition to the already adopted regulations that were still implemented. And finally, the other comment we've received on facility-based measures. As you know, we don't have primary regulatory authority over mobile sources, but we do have some limited regulatory authority under some of the indirect source rules. We know that some of that authority could be challenged legally through some federal laws. Our approach at this point is to work collaboratively with these sources, the warehouses, the rail yards, the airports, the marine ports, and new development and redevelopment projects, and see what types of best practices can be applied, see if targets can be set, see if enforceable mechanisms can be developed for which you can get SIP credit. So that's our initial approach, but we want to make sure that we can be collaborative at first. We'll trust. We need to verify those emission reductions, but if at any time we're not achieving those emission reductions or the collaborative approach doesn't seem to be yielding results, we will be setting up a program to quickly pivot and test that regulatory authority. And Henry has recently talked about, within the measures, putting a little bit more specifics in the measures on timelines in terms of when we would have to report back to the board and report on progress in all these areas, and potentially recommend regulation if needed. So that concludes my presentation on those major issues on the response to the release. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm going to let the other board members, I have a question, but I'll save it until the end. I'm quite sure the other board members may have some questions or comments. Anyone?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I have a question. I want to know where we do find this money.
That's the next presentation.
Dr. Berg, with regards to finding the money, we actually have a plan that Henry Hogo is going to present to you, and that's in the next presentation. So if you don't mind, we could do that shortly.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
No problem. Now I have one other question, and that is the Ted Lieu comments, Congressman Lieu, how do we rationalize those with this plan?
I'm not sure that we can rationalize his comments with the plan. I mean, he's looking at various safety considerations and prioritization for a study that would be done specific to the ExxonMobil refinery. We can discuss how we're going to move forward. Obviously, that's an area that I want to discuss with you to get your input in terms of responding to them. But it really shouldn't be considered part of the AQMP.
Okay, okay.
Dr. Fine, my question is, in your comment on the very first slide, current status, where you state on July 8th, 2016, U.S. EPA finalized a rule for attainment of the 1999-97 annual PM 2.5, 24-hour PM 2.5 standard. What had we been basing all of our projections on that may be different, if there is any difference? And I'm just kind of, getting caught up because you're saying this now standard is almost a 20-year standard and they're just now finalizing it. What have we been doing over these almost 20 years? Uh-oh, what happened?
We're still
Oh,
here.
there we go, okay. Yes, I'm sorry. My screen went black there for a moment.
It's a good color.
So Dr. Parker, these previous standards required previous AQMPs and SIPs, and those were adopted by the board and approved by EPA and included measures that we brought forward to the board as regulations and achieved emission reductions to achieve these standards. So these are now revoked standards because they've been replaced with more stringent standards. There's a 12 microgram per cubic meter annual standard and a 35 microgram per cubic meter 24-hour standard. But the deadlines for those standards are still in the future at this point. But these were deadlines that for previous standards that came earlier that now EPA is making a finding that we actually met those standards. If they don't make that finding, there are still some Clean Air Act requirements that would have kicked in even for a revoked standard.
Dr. Parker, if I could add something to that. This is Barbara. The standards were adopted in 1997, but along with the ozone standard that was adopted at that same time, that was all challenged in a lawsuit that actually went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, came back for remand. Congress amended the law to provide that EPA couldn't designate anybody as non-attainment until after 5 years of monitoring. So we didn't get started in 1997 on these standards. We got started really, the clock, the 10-year clock for attainment got started quite a bit later than it ordinarily would. And this is also to point out that EPA's finding that we've attained the standard is actually based on 2011 through 2013. So we did attain the standard way back then. It took them this long to get around to actually finalizing that determination. So it really hasn't taken 2 full decades to accomplish that.
Thank you very much, because that was a little bit, and obviously I'm asking the question because I wasn't, around, and that's good information that we really have challenged this in court, or been challenged in court for a while, and it was really kind of stayed during that period of time. So thank you very much, Barbara, and Dr. Fine as well. Any further questions? Dr. Lewd?
Yeah, sure.
Ms. Mitchell?
I have given staff some feedback at the last workshop in Carson. When was that? 2 days ago? But I would like to make sure that under our opportunities to require transportation control measures, that we're looking at that, because although it can take time, there is a planning process that occurs on a regular basis, and I think that we haven't asserted our authority or fulfilled our responsibility as much as we can and should with those transportation control measures in the past. I don't think we should just sit back and tell SCAG we will accept whatever's convenient. I think we have to be more aggressive and more assertive than that. On the fleet rules, Henry, I looked through the appendix, and I got to tell you, I know at the board meeting you told me it was all in the appendix. It's not as clear as it needs to be. I think, what's really important, not only for us as an agency, but also for all the stakeholders who come And what we're doing is they need to know, they need to understand, and unless we're clearly saying, we're gonna revisit the fleet rules, we're gonna take a look at what emission reductions we can get, because we haven't done it in, 13, 14, 15 years. We need to be really clear and transparent about that so people understand what that really means.
And Dr. Lou, I would just add that we did hear a number of suggestions and talking to a number of different groups. And I know Dr. Fine and I have talked about addressing those specific measures in the next revision. So we'll be definitely looking at that and seeing how we can incorporate your suggestions as well as many others.
Thank you.
And I guess I would just add one other comment, and I would ask Dr. Fine if he could comment to the importance of the approval by EPA, particularly as it pertains to progress in the future.
Approval of the plan itself?
Yeah. And of it meeting the standard.
The PM 2.5 standard?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the finding that we met that PM 2.5 standard is important, and Barbara can talk about some of the Clean Air Act fees and things that kick in if you don't even meet a revoked standard. And if you don't meet that revoked standard, you'd have to submit a new SIP. So this is an important finding, obviously. But again, we have additional PM 2.5 standards to meet. Beyond that, this plan addresses the tighter PM 2.5 standards in the future. I didn't go into details in this presentation, but the NOx heavy strategy to meet ozone will get us to those PM 2.5 standards. So this does put us on track, but I do want to mention what a accomplishment that is. This represents about a 50% reduction in PM 2.5 levels over about an 11-year period, which when these standards were first promulgated, I don't think anyone would have anticipated that we could have achieved such reductions in such a short period of time. And now we're getting those same kind of questions on the ozone plan, whether that's possible. So it's an example of how we can actually achieve these standards.
And to me, that's one of the most significant aspects is that, again, it's something that's very difficult to do. It's taken time, but we've gotten there. So even though there was a tremendous amount of skepticism on issue, staff has continued to put its head down, work through the issues. And I think when we look at the AQMP, there's a number of questions that are being raised. We'll be responsible, diligent, address those issues, and continue to move forward, and hopefully continue to get the approvals and meet those standards.
Mr. Nasser, can you and Dr. Fine quantify those emission reduction as it come through mostly regulatory adoptions or it's incentive-based? And I recognize there's been part of both, but can you quantify them as to 50%, 60% in one versus the other?
We can roughly qualify that, and I would say that...
I would say the majority came from regulatory actions in the past on the stationary source side, but a lot on the mobile source side. The truck and bus rule by CARB was very significant, and past actions by CARB on the off-road side. Henry can fill in here a little bit. Fuel improvements, but I don't want to, but also on the stationary source side, there have been significant regulatory efforts over the past 10 to 20 years on the stationary source side to reduce NOx and direct PM 2.5 emissions that have led to this. Incentives in the past have played a role, especially in the more recent years, as more money has been put towards it. But if I had to put a percentage, it's probably at least 80, 90% on the regulatory side.
In the near. Yeah. So just to add to Dr. Fine's comment, this is Henry. When you look at the ARB's mobile source strategy, they talk about the reductions associated with existing regulations, similar to what Dr. Fine presented earlier on our stationary source side, and it does achieve about 80 to 90%. And the remainder is still a very large amount of emission reductions, over 100 tons per day of NOx from the mobile source sector. And in that remaining section, and I was planning to talk a little bit more in detail about this mobile source strategy, is to look at regulatory actions that will be in the 2025 timeframe, because current regulations go out to 2023, and for new cars and new the emission standards go all the way out to 2025. So they're looking, ARB is looking to establish new standards in that 2025 timeframe. So the question is, how do we achieve the standard in 2023? And in our discussions with ARB, the technologies have not matured enough to go beyond, for instance, the 2010 emission standards, because there are no products out except for one at this point, so we need new products. So developing a regulation that requires more in the near term may not be as effective as looking at massive turnover to cleaner technologies, especially on the off-road side. So that was the focus of the mobile source strategy.
Dr. Parker, if I could go back a minute to the measures that contributed to attaining the standards that EPA has found that we have attained. One of the most significant measures would actually the Air Resources Board's regulation for low sulfur fuel for large marine vessels. Yeah. And that the sulfur from those vessels contributed by formation in the atmosphere into particulates. That was a very large emission reduction, and but was also litigated, and we intervened to support CARB's rule, and actually that was taken to the Supreme Court, but the court denied review because EPA and the government actually suggested that they should deny review on that rule. That was a very significant effort that went together with the public affairs effort to get legislation to require EPA to regulate marine vessels that was introduced by Senator Boxer. And those two efforts together caused the International Maritime Organization to adopt international standards for emission control areas, such as the area that surrounds the North American continent now. So that now low sulfur fuel, as pioneered by CARB, is being used by ships of the large cargo crude oil type ships that are coming in within 200 miles of the United States coast. So it's had benefits all over the country.
Well,
I guess having
thank you very much, Bob.
I would say, Dr. Parker, having actually worked on that issue, the reason EPA and at the time the Bush administration preferred to go with the congressional ratification of the IMO Annex 6. And so there were a number of people, a number of groups that actually worked with Congress to get that advanced. And that was actually ratified in 2008, and that led to some tremendous reductions in terms of risk to the United States as a whole. So there was a lot of effort going on during that time.
And I guess the reason why I asked those questions is because obviously we, in our AQMP, we are posing somewhat of a different magnitude of approach to solving our, problems or being able to meet our standards. Are there any of these kinds of technologies that are out there that we know about that we don't have the control or the authority to implement through regulatory issues? Because, that would really get us this kind of significant drop, 50 or 60% drop from where we are right now, down to those particular levels that we can look at. I mean, we've been talking about those as it relates to that of the black box, but we've been also talking about eliminating the black box and really being able to truly eliminate the emissions so that we could truly say that the air is cleaner. Does anybody, I guess Henry is going to be talking about. Henry, why don't we go ahead and let you start, unless some of the board members have further questions, and maybe that will answer some of those concerns or questions as we go along, unless someone.
Well, Dr. Parker, I could just add that the ultra-low NOx petition that we're talking about really sort of, I would say, reinforces that national approach, if not an international approach. And that national approach, when, again, we submitted our petition, it was with other states, other local air agencies. And I think the fact that we can demonstrate that you're going to have almost 35 states move into non-attainment creates a bigger level of support or more support for that national rulemaking. And that would be, in a way, similar to congressional action of the IMO Annex 6 treaty. So the concept and the strategy is very similar. Build a larger national presence to have sort of that bigger impact. And that regulatory action would then help us in terms of having a regulatory enforcement event that we can provide the incentive funding for. And I know Henry will talk a little bit more about that.
Dr. Parker?
Yes.
I
Go right
do
ahead.
have one question. This goes along with what we are discussing because our AQMP sets forth a certain percentage of reductions to be obtained through the fair share of the federal government. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, but I'm wondering what we have heard from the federal government in response to this effort that we are exerting to get the federal government to participate in helping us reach attainment.
We've heard very positive feedback. I think I can share with you that, as you know, part of our strategy was to have pressure from the White House on EPA, and then also providing congressional pressure on EPA so that they would move forward with the NOx standard. EPA, as you recall, sort of pushed back on us saying, we need to finish this phase 2 greenhouse gas rule. We think we'll be able to address this issue. That's all we're going to say. In private discussions, we've heard that the administrator said, we don't need the White House pressure, we don't need congressional pressure, we understand. We have an obligation to move forward, we're going to do so. So without them giving us an exact date of when they're going to get started, I would say, and what I've said is that I'm optimistic that they'll complete the greenhouse gas rule by the end of July, and that shortly thereafter, maybe 30, 45 days, we would expect them to announce initiation on the NOx rule as well. And they also recognize that from a design standpoint, they need to let the engineering, engine manufacturers know what are the real components as they move forward. So I think there's the continued support for EPA to move forward, all the pressure that we're doing, all of that is really, I think, motivate them to move forward quickly.
I'm not sure that's the exact question. Judy, were you asking more about whether we're having a federal assignment within the AQMP and whether EPA will accept that?
Well, I'm wondering just what efforts I know we're doing the low NOx, but also what the response has been from the federal government with accepting a fair share allotment out of our AQMP. We're working on that through this low NOx petition, but I guess I guess that is the answer. If you say yes, they're coming forward, they're going to help us with that, they're going to move forward in 45 days or so to start the rulemaking on a low NOx heavy duty engine is perhaps that we can assume that is their acceptance of that assignment.
Well, technically,
you want to comment on that, please?
Well, I would say technically we're not making an assignment. EPA would decline that in about 30 seconds. But what we're trying to do is say to EPA that if you can begin this rulemaking effort, that this would address a lot of our concerns from a federal perspective. And then the incentive side would also help accelerate and address that federal role, if you will. So I think there's a technicality when we talk about an assignment to EPA. An assignment is a very specific and very serious issue that, for the most part, they will say no. So I know San Joaquin has said they're actually making it an assignment. EPA will decline that very quickly, I believe. We're not making that, quote, assignment. We're recognizing that they have a significant role and that we want to help them address that role through regulatory action and through the use of incentive funds to drive that down. But we're not making a specific assignment.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a good clarification.
Thank you.
And the other thing we will look to for the federal government is incentive funding. And so that's another step that I think Henry's going to address as well.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chairman.
Okay. Henry, you're up. Let's propose action to identify funding needed to implement the 2016 AQMP.
Well, good morning again, Dr. Parker and members of the committee. I think I can skip maybe 3 slides because I said probably a lot in those 3 slides. But I do want to point out again that the concept of having regulations later on to achieve the 2031 standard are all in the ARB's mobile source strategy. Again, looking early on to achieve the 2023 standard, it really will be looking at tightening up existing regulations to ensure that compliance with existing standards occur. And at the same time, looking at turnover of older vehicles to newer vehicles. As an example, we talked to ARB about the truck and bus regulation. As you know, the fleets that have to comply with this regulation beginning last year would be to go to a 2010 engine by 2023. We talked to ARB about encouraging fleets to, as they comply, to purchase an engine that meets an optional NOx standard. And the 0.02 gram natural gas engine is certified to that level. However, no other engines are at this time. So, but there are engines that do certify at a lower level. Specifically, Volvo has 3 engines that are at the 0.06 gram level, and we encourage fleets to purchase those engines over an engine that is at closer to 0.2 gram, the existing standard. So we've been working with ARB and looking at how to encourage fleets to purchase cleaner engines as they move forward. And of course, there are provisions in the truck and bus regulation for the purchase of zero emission engines, trucks, and also for alternative fuel trucks that they get extra credit if they purchase those vehicles towards their compliance. So we want to encourage fleets to go in that route where they can. Looking forward though, but for 2023, the near term is really looking at accelerating vehicle turnover and then identifying the actions that have co-benefits. The low carbon transportation funding that moves forward will provide funding for zero emission and near zero emission technologies, and they have co-benefit for not only greenhouse gases but for NOx, and so we want to look at that. And then, as Dr. Fine mentioned, our facility-based measures were meant to start the discussion of how to implement ARB's measures that are called further deployment measures. These are measures that have no defined action, but there are 4 sets of concepts for actions that are in those further development measures. The 4 concepts are partially incentives program, and as technologies are deployed, ARB will be looking at developing regulatory actions for those to bring about greater deployment of those technologies. The third one is to look at operational efficiencies and how that can be quantified. And the fourth concept is to look at the technologies such as intelligent transportation systems, ITS, autonomous and connected vehicle technologies that improve efficiency, how those reductions can be quantified and then taken into the SIP. But as Dr. Fine mentioned, we will start a collaborative process. And during our process, public process, it's actually a rulemaking process anyway, because whatever information we gather during the public process, we will bring back to the board to make a recommendation as to how to move forward, either through a more continuing the collaborative process if those actions are realized, but if not, the staff will seek board's direction moving forward from that point on a different regulatory approach or other approaches. The SCAQMD does include a funding analysis, and staff took a look at the historic funding levels and the types of funding that have been given out on the mobile source side, and we estimated the funding needed to achieve the reductions associated with what ARB calls the further deployment measures. These are the measures that, as I mentioned, have the 4 concepts. We looked at this from the point that if funding was available to these measures, this will be the maximum amount. So other actions that ARB intends to proceed, the other three items, regulatory approach, looking at operational efficiency, and new technologies, those have benefits which aren't quantified yet. So the amount of funding will be reduced as those actions occur. So there are three funding scenarios that I'd like to discuss at this point. The first one is based on use of Carr-Moyer cost effectiveness criteria. The current cost effectiveness criteria is around $18,262 per ton. And in discussion with ARB, they believe that cost effectiveness will go up to $30,000 per ton in that range in the near term. And as they look further out, it will go up to $50,000 per ton to cover zero emission technologies. And they indicated as a new standard kicks in, so if there's a new ultra low NOx standard, funding from the Moyer program would only be for zero emission technology or something akin to zero emission technology that's lower than 0.02 grams. So that $50,000 per ton could increase over time. The second scenario, we looked at funding by each of the source category and the emission reductions associated with those source categories that are in the mobile source strategy. And we looked at it from a mix of per vehicle funding as well as using of the Moyer cost effectiveness criteria. On a per vehicle funding, as many of you know, our Proposition 1B program offers $50,000 to replace an older truck with a newer truck or a new truck. And at times we have augmented that $50,000 with additional funding when it comes to alternative fuel truck. We also looked at funding levels for light duty vehicles. Currently we have the CVRP and the FMP programs that can actually go up to almost $12,000 per vehicle, depending on if you're qualified for one or the other programs. Then, for federal sources, ARB and South Dakota staff talked about whether we should have a per equipment or per vehicle funding, and it was decided that we just use a Moyer funding criteria. I'll give you an example. A good example are locomotives. And we recently funded the passenger locomotives, but more recently we're funding for line haul locomotives from BNSF. And over the years, what we found is that it's very cost effective to fund locomotives. And we believe that use of criteria, Moyer criteria, cost effectiveness criteria may be more appropriate for these federal sources. And then lastly, we looked at a funding scenario where we targeted lower number of equipment and vehicles and with a higher overall cost effectiveness. For example, instead of funding 2 million vehicles for 5 tons per day of NOx reduction, we looked at looking further at heavy duty vehicles and achieving 5 tons per day at a much lower cost in terms of funding for those vehicles. This chart, which is a summary of the tables that are in Chapter 4 of the AQMP, and in parentheses we indicate where the tables come from. I'm just going to go to the bottom line, that based on our analysis for mobile sources, we estimate that between $10 to $12 billion over the next 15 years will be needed if we're to assist in achieving a cleanup of these vehicles and then attaining the air quality standard. So I do want to make sure everyone understands that this is funding assistance. It's not the total cost of turning over the vehicles. It's our historic traditional approach looking at funding assistance to accelerate turnover. And in the AQMP, you see a number which has another $1.5 to $2 billion on top of that. That's to cover the stationary source side. of looking at funding on that side of the equation. Also in the draft ACMP, staff identified 7 actions from the national level to the local level that would be taken to help identify the funding. On a national level, staff believe a national clean air investment and cleanup fund could be established similar to a super fund type of program that's been in place for many years. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in order to move forward, we believe that there needs to be established a national collaborative of non-attainment areas. Right now we have various regional collaboratives such as the West Coast Collaborative, we have the Northeast Collaborative, and we have the Great Lakes Collaborative. They all are looking at working together within their region to look for funding to help clean up equipment in their region. But each collaborative actually compete with each other on a national level. So we believe establishing a national collaborative would be an appropriate way to go. That way we can look at the priorities and not wind up competing with each region. And we will seek to work through NACA to establish this national collaborative. On the state level, we need to do some outreach to our state legislature and on the co-benefits of criteria pollutant reduction as well as greenhouse gas emission reduction, and so that understand when it comes to appropriations and allocation of funding or establishing new programs, that we maximize the benefits, environmental benefits of these programs. And then looking at establishing new funding programs. And that could be done in terms of a Proposition 1B type program, bond measures that can come forward. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. On the regional and local level, we want to continue looking at activities that are occurring today. There's a proposed ballot measure that's sponsored by Move LA to look at improving our transportation infrastructure, but there is an element for cleaning up vehicles and providing zero and near zero emission technologies. So these ballot measures are moving forward. We want to look at those closely. Also look at initiating new funding programs locally and regionally. And lastly, we want to reinvigorate the Strategic Alliance initiative that the board adopted back in 2002 that have several elements of it, which included forming alliances not only within our region and within our state, public-private partnerships, but also looking across the nation as we look towards a national collaborative. So I talked a little bit about funding opportunities. Staff's thinking that the $10 to $12 billion over the 15 years will come from multiple sources. We're looking at expanding existing funding program levels, looking at identifying new sources of funding, but all this will require a combination of legislative action, voter approval if it comes to bond measures, and public-private partnerships. Just some examples of where funding could come from. The first one here is the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act of 2015. The state of California put in over 40 projects under this current funding round, and the region received 0 funding. And out of that 40, only 13 projects, I believe, were funded throughout the nation. And the only one that I know of in California is the SR 11, State Route 11 in San Diego that crosses eastern Otay Mesa into Mexico. And that was $49 million out of $800 million. So this is an example where priorities are not placed in terms of looking at infrastructure and looking at air quality. So that's one area There are still other funding under the FAST Act for transportation improvement. We'll work with the state in looking at how funding can come to California and to our region. I want to go back to the stimulus funding, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. Congress in 1 year appropriated $787 billion out of the national treasury of funds that were not appropriated that year towards the to the stimulus fund. And out of that 787 billion, our understanding is that almost all that money have been expended. But this is an example of what congressional action could do if a national collaborative is established to encourage development of a national clean air investment and cleanup fund, that Congress can looking at $15 billion to $13 billion. This is probably small change relative to the amount of money that we're talking about in terms of a one-time action that could be done. The DERA, Diesel Emission Reduction Act of 2005, focused specifically on cleaning up diesel equipment, and that's a yearly funding that goes through appropriations, and we're seeing somewhat increase in the amount of funding, but it's not nearly enough for our purposes in order to attain clean air standards. The fourth item is the Superfund program. That actually was authorized in 1980. It has expired in 1995, but Congress continues to fund the Superfund program, and to the order of $500 million to $1 billion a year. So we still see that as an ongoing program. So a similar type of program could be established for air quality purposes. In terms of some other examples at state level, as I mentioned, Proposition 1B, there are discussions on the state level of having a new bond measure to not only move forward with Proposition 1B to improve our transportation infrastructure, but also to look at a goods movement emission reduction program. The original Proposition 1B was for $1 billion. The South Coast region received about $550 million out of that $1 billion over the years, and we're at the last couple of years of that program. Car Moya program, we received about $52 million per year, and we see that going until at least 2025. We need to extend that further in order to cover 2031. We have our MSRC AB 2766 local government matching program. We've been encouraging local governments to fund real quantifiable emission reduction programs, and the MSRC have been funding on the order of about $20 million a year towards cleaning up older diesel equipment. Of course, low carbon transportation funds are still on the table for discussion. And on and off, we have received funds through settlement, and the BP ARCO being the largest one. As you recall, it was about over $100 million, although SCAQMD did see only a portion of that. We did have that big settlement. So settlement funds can go towards the program. AB 1318 was a mitigation program established for the Sentinel power plant, and they're funding from that. So there are opportunities such as these we see come about. So looking at the new funding, I mentioned Proposition 1B and the VW settlement funds. Mary Nichols gave an overview of what that settlement funds look like for California. Under the proposed settlement, there'll be two pots of money. The first pot is $2.7 billion towards it can be for vehicle replacement, is to reduce diesel emissions. And that is a nationwide dollar amount, $2.7 billion. California expects to get about 18% of that $2.7 billion. It's based on auto sales throughout the nation. And what Mary Nichols indicated was that ARB will be seeking projects that will be submitted to the Department of Justice for their approval to move forward. So each state will be submitting a plan on how their portion of the funds will be expended. The other portion of the VW settlement is $2 billion, which will go towards infrastructure for zero emission. This includes not only electric charging stations, but also hydrogen and stations. And so that will be moving forward. The California is indicating that they should have the right to about 40% of that funding. So that has not been settled yet. But this is only for infrastructure and for zero emission advanced zero emission technology outreach and education. I mentioned the Move LA proposal for a ballot measure R2 that most likely will be on the November ballot, but it's moving forward. And lastly, we listed other concepts. As some of you may know, SCAG is looking at various revenue sources to help fund improving transportation infrastructure. And in the 2012 RTP, as well as the 2016 RTP, they identified other sources of revenues, which include mileage-based user fee or a vehicle miles travel fee. And in their analysis in Chapter 4 of the 2016 RTP, they estimate that with a 4 cents per mile fee, that they around $124 billion could be realized in revenues over a 15-year period. So when we look at that 124 billion with a 4 cent per mile, if we had just a half cent per mile, we could get almost $1 billion per year towards our program if we just added half cent to the 4 cent per mile. So those are other concepts that, one of the other concepts that are floating out there that could help fund turnover of vehicles. I want to end with a couple slides to talk about the proposed activities as we move forward. We have already initiated discussion at the national level, and we'll continue that through NACA to establish, to form this coalition, a collaborative of non-attainment areas and begin to formulate a set of goals that could be submitted to the new president's transition team. And NACA indicated that they are in the process of formulating what the air pollution agencies will want to see under the new administration. And that's going on over August and September. So we want to move quickly to establish this and work with NACA so that we can move forward with the National Clean Air Investment and Cleanup Fund. We want to form a working group of stakeholders. And this is probably not going to be the traditional working group of stakeholders, although we want our stakeholders there, but we want their stakeholders, folks who can lobby on the state level and on the national level towards looking at funding and looking at where funding can be established by at the national level, new funding programs, and also for the state level. So it's going to require some amount of thinking, and we want to work with our legislative consultants, both at the state level and at the national level, to see how funding programs could be developed towards that. And then we also want to look at review of our existing programs and where funding could be occurred. And Ms. Mitchell mentioned about the San Joaquin Authority to have an increased funding level. We wanted to look at that under our legal authority and what may need to be done legislatively if we want to increase that funding. We want to prepare a draft plan that will go as a companion piece with the adoption of the 2016 AQMP that will show what the actions will be needed to move forward to look for the funding. And then as we move forward with the adoption of the plan, we look at securing the funding, and we want to report back to the board and through various committees on the progress towards realizing that funding. And with that, that concludes staff presentation.
Probably closer to 20.
Thank you very much, Henry. Very, very enlightening. I did notice one thing, and obviously, Chair, I want to put my little 2 cents in. Am I wrong in not finding anywhere in here relative to the proposed funding sources being the cap and trade funds? I know this sounds, I see Mrs. Mitchell is looking at saying, you know, that may not be a realistic alternative, but
that is listed as low carbon transportation fund. That is the cap and trade fund. On slide
We're assuming that's going to be funded for how long?
That's on slide number 12, Dr. Parker.
Through 2031?
Well,
There's no assumptions yet.
It's expired already.
Well, there's part of the grand bargain, and I think what we need to do is make sure that we weigh in. What Henry was describing was the opportunity that we have with regards to existing funds. And I think there's other aspects that we've looked at that we haven't touched on yet that sort of speak to the strengths that we have in terms of population, in terms of the economic factors, that we think would give us a significant chunk of those funds. But we definitely understand the instability right now. But that's also in part why we think that if we have that discussion out there about the funding that we need, that will help drive the discussion on the importance of renewing that fund.
My concern is, I'm sure everyone's concern is, that this is an unprecedented amount of money probably in the history of the world for a agency such as ours to attempt to raise over the period of time that we're going to raise it. I would like to be part of that effort, and I would like that effort to be successful. But to be honest, in looking at the presentation today, if you take out the ifs, maybes, and perhaps, we're not even close to 10% of the total.
We got Dr. Parker's 2 cents. He just threw it in.
Yeah, right. I was hoping he'd say he would send us a check for the first year.
He's your friend. Go ahead and ask him.
So you know, you can't give all that money to your kids. So, but I'm looking for a more solidified approach, and I don't even know if we can get it at this point in the plan. But I'd like to get some real numbers from real places so that we know we have something that we can take to people and say, look, we've gotten 300 million, 500 million, 20 million, and this is what we need. Because I'm not feeling any solid numbers underneath any of this. So that's my concern.
I think what we need to do is a better job of showing those solid numbers. I mean, we do have Carl Moyer funds, we do have DERA funds. I think that if we looked at it right now, we would say that we're probably about roughly 10% of the way there. But we can do a much better job. Yeah, about 100 million.
So about 100 million. Well,
Right.
let me tell you, that's much closer than people understand, because I don't think there's been a day go by since we announced this plan that somebody hasn't said to me, $1 billion, you know, I've got some kind of dementia that I forgot the number. I've not forgot this number. I know this number is huge. So I think every board member should have the ability to talk to people in a manner that would show them that we're conscientious in being able to reach that objective.
I think that's a great idea.
And we can't always, and Miss Mitchell can't be put on the hook for this. You know, I know we have to get some money from CARB, but you know, we're the guys who put the plan together, so we need to find the money.
Right.
Now, I'm willing to go anywhere, do anything to help find this money. But you can't hang it all on CARB.
I think that's an excellent idea that if we had a chart of relative funding and relative numbers that we would have, and each one of the board members would look at those and then try to work toward those objectives of people that we know and we can talk to, and be it at the state level or the federal government level, and we then have a realistic plan that we can say these are the numbers that people should be contributing toward this particular effort, including that of the governor, as in reference to helping that of Mrs. Mitchell or the pro tem in the Senate and the speaker in the House, obviously in the Assembly. All of those things themselves are going to help us to really then be able to formulate some very specific plans utilizing the folks that we have on board right now. I mean, because we got a lot of people that know a lot of people, and if it's a matter of just being able to reach out to those individuals to kind of get them into a meaningful mindset. You know, sometimes, I guess they say about advertising, you have to tell people something 12 to more times before they even get it in their mind. If they keep hearing it from us, we need this, and this is what we expect to get from you, sooner or later we'll probably be able to make some real dent into these processes rather than having them kind of a scattered approach with no real positive approach directly to it. And that's really going to help us then with the public perception is that, yes, we know where the money is buried right now, and we certainly have a plan of how we're going to get there. Further comments from the other board members?
Dr. Parker, I would just say that we can see from this report that we need to be looking to different sources for the money. It's not going to all come from one place. And so what would be useful in light of the comments that have been made is to put forward some kind of strategic plan right now from the sources that we think we can call on and start working on that strategic plan. And that would be, of course, we have the plan for a super fund for air from the federal government. We want to see if we can't get Prop 1B extended. That would be another good source. From cap and trade funds right now are sort of precarious, so I think we should keep our eye on that. And then the 1/2 cent measure for VMT, which would get you $1 billion a year, which is what we need. To keep our eye on that. There's been controversy over a VMT because people are concerned about their privacy. Oh, you're going to track where I'm going in my vehicle now, and I don't want anything to do with that. So that privacy issue is sort of rising to the top, and people need to be assured that if they have a sales a tax on VMT, that it won't affect their privacy. But that certainly is the direction that we're going to be going, because as we're reducing gasoline use, we're moving toward a tax on the number of miles that you travel. So, but I think I'd like to see from our staff now some kind of strategic plan developed what direction we go, and every board member could be apprised of that. And we know people, as Dr. Parker said, we have networks of people that we can work with to try and get those sources up and running. Thank you.
I have one last question for myself. It was my understanding that we are not at the limit of our statutory authority under the license plate fee arrangement that we have. Is that true or false?
Dr. Burke, we have exercised all the authority that this board has to impose fees on motor vehicles. That includes the AB 2766 portion that funds MSRC as well as local governments as well as district mobile source programs. We've also enacted the additional $2 that has been authorized for the Carl Moyer program, and that's the fee that Henry mentioned that's going to expire in 2024. So that's all the authority that we currently have. The San Joaquin District does have a specific statute that gives them additional authority to adopt up to $30. My understanding is they've adopted $15 worth of that fee.
But one of the things that we're doing on that regard.
Did we have a similar regulation?
Dr. Burke, my recollection is we tried to get that authority from the legislature at the time, but were unsuccessful, but I don't recall the specific details of why. But we could go back to the legislature.
There's something going on that I don't understand, because let me tell you my recollection, okay? We raised the fee a couple dollars.
Yes.
About 3 or 4 years ago. And at that time, I had just a violent argument with Dr. Wallerstein because he did not want to raise it to the maximum that we could go to, because that would have been like $10 or $12 and would have given us an enormous amount of money. Now, you're telling me that we're at the max, but from my recollection, and I'm willing to call him on it, that's not what I recall. So I want to find out about that, because this could be a substantial revenue source for this program. If my recollection is accurate, and we can find what we were talking about.
Dr. Burke, on that front.
Do you remember, Barbara, do you remember about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, raising the fee $2 on vehicle licensing?
Yeah, I think it was longer ago than that, Dr. Burke, but yes, we did do that, and that was the AB 923 section that allowed us to fund the Carl Moyer program through that fee.
And it could have been that you were talking about negotiations in the legislature of how much money that was going to be.
Now, this was a pre-allocated limit that we had that we had not attained. Well, I'm going to call Barry and ask him, so, and see if he remembers, because it was a vitriolic argument, because I wanted to take it up and get all the money, and then he was just unalterably opposed to that.
But in the meantime,
so
Dr.
there's something. I'm sorry?
I would say while you're doing that, one of the things that we're also looking at is if in fact there are additional funds, or if there are not additional funds, what are the existing authorities that we have, and what could we come back to the board with in terms of needed additional authority to advance it to the point that you're talking about. So we need to report back to you on all of those options, and hopefully you can get us clarification when you talk to Dr. Wallerstein.
Great. Great. Any other? I don't want to make one call, so if there's any other questions, you let me know.
Well, take some notes on my questions, Dr. Burke, and ask him all of these too. I've got a lot of stuff, so I'm gonna take a deep breath. I'll get it out. I think you guys can all take it down, and you don't have to cover every point of this, and we can have more detailed conversations later. But first and foremost, I was thinking this morning about the fact that there's at least two things going on when we start talking about this money that are big picture items we need to really think about. One is, where is the fair place to get it? And we know that, based on the emissions inventory, there's certain categories of groups that are responsible for certain categories of emissions, and it would be the most fair if everyone paid their fair share based off those categories. Then there's the reality of where that money is likely to come from. And those two things aren't necessarily in parallel. I think they're at cross purposes a lot of the time. And we have to then think hard about what money we're going to pursue and how fair it is and what we're comfortable with, and getting in that space between the difference between the two. And as I've said in the past, I'm really concerned that we don't put the burden of paying for this on the people who can least afford it. There's also sections of industry that, even though they're responsible for a lot of it, like the shipping companies, they're all losing money right now, and they're going through consolidations and all sorts of problems because there's far too much capacity and not enough business for them. But the people who ship cargo can more afford it. Now, I don't know how you go about exactly putting it on that, but that's, I think, the thought that we have to have, and the thought processes we have to go through. In addition to which, wouldn't it be more fair if we import 40% of the goods, that some of the people outside of this district were covering some of those costs of the impacts that they're having on us? Those kind of conversations and those issues, I think we need to pay attention to. And the one good thing within all this, in terms of the big picture stuff, is I think you're hearing very consistent comments from board members about the skepticism and concerns, and agreement and consensus about the need to have that reasonable certainty. I was also thinking about what reasonable certainty means when it comes to being able to demonstrate, not just for us, but also for EPA, that they can approve this. And it means you don't have to be absolutely certain, you don't have to have the money in your pocket. But as Dr. Burke was saying, we have to really have a credible plan of getting the money if this is the path we're taking. And we're a long way from that today, so this would be difficult.
That's why I think, remember they raised the license plate fees?
Yeah, I don't know where that came from. Anyway, my second thing, the existing money, there's a bunch of stuff under here. The Move LA ballot measure, that thing is basically cooked. And I've personally, with a lot of professional colleagues, fought to try to get goods movement, equipment deployment money into that, and it didn't happen. And so we might not be in as good a position as we could have been, or we would hope to be, with this transportation measure for LA County. That means someone needs to talk to some supervisors, and we need to, see what we can do at this late stage. It might be that horse might have left the stable. FAST Act money, what happened with that is not encouraging in terms of what the federal government is thinking about what our needs are and whether we are a priority for them. We have to figure that out, because it doesn't bode well for being, putting together a credible plan for money. One section of existing money we haven't talked about is that harbor maintenance fee. I think, Wayne, I might have talked with you about it. There's an existing harbor maintenance fee that the harbors across the country pay into. Our ports pay in more money than they get back with regard to that. So this is something that, one, I think they would love our help in making sure that money is more fairly distributed back to them, what they're putting into it, but also that perhaps that might be supplemented in some way, shape, or form for an air quality component that would help all the ports across the country, but also help us. So that might be another way to form a coalition around existing fee, and it's an existing appropriation that happens. When we talk about Moyer, extending Moyer past 2025, you have to take into account what it took to get Moyer to 23, I think it is, all through. And that was a 2/3 vote of the legislature that demanded and required some sacrifices. So that is never an easy thing to do. So on the existing front, we've got our challenges too. Third, I think we all don't have to, and it's related, don't have to only think about offense in terms of raising the money. I think we have to think about defense. And in terms of defense, some of the things that are practical now, like getting the ultra low NOx engines into buses, like it's happening in Santa Monica with the Big Blue bus. One of the reasons they can do that is because they struck a deal to get their fuel for almost nothing. And the reason they could do that is because we have a low carbon fuel standard. Now, that low carbon fuel standard may be in jeopardy, and those sort of existing programs that create markets that make deals like that ultra low NOx Big Blue bus decision, we have to keep in mind, because we have to maybe play defense as well as offense on these issues. Okay, fourth, in all my years of doing this, I have heard one single presentation on where to raise money. And that was the 2013 Hagen-Schmidt conference that was focusing on goods movement, and the Air Resources Board had a guy named Dan Smith from Tioga Group come in and talk about where money comes from, what people think about it, how credible it is to raise it, and he really was talking about the likelihood of being able to raise big chunks of money to deal with goods movement. Bottom line is, I don't think we're the experts in this. We should think about going out and finding who the experts are of putting together money like this. Now, I know Denny Zane at Move LA is a miracle maker when it comes to raising billions of dollars for transportation. But also, he's not the person to do it, I think, for air quality, even though he's a past president of Coalition for Clean Air, so you got to give him some credit. But I think we need some really good consultants, some people who understand this better than we do, and who can provide us some good advice on putting together credible sources of revenue to pay for clean air. And lastly, when we talk about this, we have to talk about it in terms of the cost savings too, because the cost savings are going to be greater than what we're spending. We're spending more than this in a lot of ways. I know you did that at the workshop. It was really good. We're spending so much more on this, on health and on public health alone. If there were just a way to leverage those public health savings, we'd be able to pay for this. The problem is, it's not that easy. You know, I mean, and I don't know if it helps to talk about it in those terms or not. Maybe our communications consultants could help us with this. But it just seems to me that unless we talk about it in terms of what we're going to save, then it makes it a lot harder for us to get people to back us up. So those are tons of questions. You don't have to answer them all now. I know we're running late, but I wanted to get all that off my chest.
Just a quick comment, Dr. Liu. All your thoughts and comments, we want to use the working process to develop and move forward, and we recognize a lot of
be on a hyper time speed.
Henry, maybe I could just say a few comments on that. So there were a lot of good ideas that were discussed. I just wanted to point out that what we tried to do today was to identify in a very broad sense the fact that there are pots of federal funds that are out there, there are pots of state funds that are out there, that there are a lot of different groups that are willing to assist us in that. We have a number of consultants both in DC and Sacramento that I think are very well qualified. What I've heard was a desire for a tremendous amount more of information, data that you can actually use as sort of talking points. I think we can certainly provide a table that shows what those needs are, what we think some of those potential opportunities are. We can come back with a detailed plan in terms of reaching out to DC. You know, with regards to like the FAST Act funding, well, we weren't involved, so if we had been involved, it would have been a different story. That's my position, and I'm sticking to it. So having said that, you know, we're going to move very aggressively to identify these issues, and I think there are a number of different mechanisms that we can look at. And whether it's a container fee, whether it's some other type of assessment that we look at a la Superfund, or whether it's a straight appropriation that's distributed out, you know, we've heard a lot of those ideas, but we've got to get going. We've got to talk to some of the congressional members. We've got to talk to the state leaders. And what Henry was trying to describe was the process for starting to pull together those stakeholders, those individuals, and start laying down the criteria that you guys are all asking for in terms of moving forward. What's important to note is that we don't have to have this finalized by the time our AQMP is submitted. EPA is not going to require it at the point that we say, here it is. It gives us time, and so what we're saying is that in conjunction with the strategy that we've done thus far, which is we've laid down a marker. We laid that marker down at DC, and we're doing it in Sacramento. These are the funds we need. You need to start thinking about that. We come back as soon as this campaign is over. We go to the people that were elected. We've already got them thinking about it, and then we can push hard come January. We will have all of the input. We will hopefully have all of this detailed. We'll have all of the criteria to move forward. And I understand it's a tremendous challenge. Believe me, and I understand the need to be able to respond to the critics. We will do that. I have no doubt. So we will get the information to you in as timely a manner as possible that provides that plan, that utilizes our outside consultants to help give us, I think, all the reassurance that we need that, in fact, this is achievable. And then we'll look at what are the additional authorities that we ourselves might be able to take advantage of and add that to the overall mix so that we can have that $1 billion a year broken down into this is what we think we can do at the district, this is what we think is available regionally, this is what we think is available at the state, and here's the pot that we're going to go after at the federal level. And then I think we can look at other aspects as well. I think there are some probably endowments, maybe some partnerships that we can look at and we can try to tap into. So we'll look into all of that and get back to you on that.
Okay.
Very good. I think that that would be very, very helpful, Astra, and you can see that you have a real pot of resources among the governing board members that have ideas, approaches, etc. And I think taking them all and putting them into one big matrix itself would certainly give us some direction that we all should be traveling. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Mr. Nastri at the end just kind of slid over something that I think we ought to really take a good look at, and that is potential partnerships with private industry and nonprofit organizations. Because it would seem to me that people like the Ford Foundation and other nonprofits like that would be interested in helping with a project like this. It would seem to me that health insurance companies would understand Dr. Liu's approach to the decrease of health costs, because it would make their bottom line get fatter. So I'd like us to also think about how we communicate with those organizations and those companies. And if we have consultants, governmental consultants coming out of our ears. But I don't know if we really have the ability to talk to nonprofits and to corporations, but we ought to think about that.
Certainly, to the extent that I remember when, as most of you know, I was in the insurance business for many, many years, and we owned 34 insurance companies, primarily in the health, accident, and life insurance business, and we gave literally millions of dollars yearly to organizations that were going to help to improve the quality of health around the country, throughout the entire 50 states that we sold insurance in. And certainly people who are good at those kind of grant writings and reaching out to reach those people would be something that we should look into. And I certainly could, Mr. Nastri, if you want to, sometime maybe you and I could have lunch or breakfast, and I could talk, share with you directly my ideas. I served on those committees in my organization to look at those proposals as they came in as to what are the kinds of things that health insurance companies themselves would be looking for that would help, that they could contribute to. So I think Dr. Burke's idea is an excellent one, is looking at it from that standpoint of view and putting that in. We got something on that that came in that put another 10% to the bottom line over these next 10 years would be very, very helpful. Takes a little while to get it off the ground, but I think it can be very meaningful. Any further questions or comments from anyone else?
One thing real quick, Dr. Parker, I jumped into your field of expertise the other day and did a little bit of math, and I calculated that the cost of paying for all of this is less than the cost of one inhaler per year per person in the district.
Very good. Congratulations.
Did you spend a lot of time doing that, John?
It only took me a couple minutes. I had to figure out the cost of an inhaler, but I found a New York Times article that said it was between $1,500. So I averaged it 75.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Fine and Hugo. I think it's been very helpful, and I think we've all had a very insightful approach in listening to it. Any other further questions or comments from anyone on this subject before we move on to the written reports? I guess everyone has seen the written reports. Any comments on the written reports, Dr. Fine, that is not already set forth therein?
No additional comments.
Any comments or questions from any of the board members? Okay, we'll receive those and for file. Hearing none. Monthly reports as well of CEQA. Any questions on those? Hearing none. Any other matters that business itself that anyone would like to bring before the committee? Any public comments there at CC8 or any other locations?
None here.
Okay, well, with that being stated, I guess that we will then adjourn this until our next September 16th meeting at 2016. We'll have a little respite for the next 2 months, and I look forward to seeing everyone back in September. The meeting is officially adjourned. Thank you very much. Good day.